Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you ever so much for joining us for this very important topic. As you know, we're doing a series of 8 webinars on housing. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about private and public seniors' residences and long-term care. And we have 2 excellent presenters. And without further ado, I would like to thank our funder, which is the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. Their funding has allowed us to produce these webinars, so we're very grateful for that. And our first presenter is going to be Vecchio, and many of you may know his name, and you may very well know him as a radio friend that comes into your house every Sunday afternoon. And he's known from Life Unrehearsed at CJD Radio. Matt is the owner of Lianas Senior Transition Support, providing guidance to families and loved ones in life transitions, elder care planning, psychosocial assessments, and senior living industry. And also he is a certified professional consultant on aging. He is also a columnist with the Suburban newspaper, which many of us get, as their seniors and aging specialist. Matt, that doesn't give you enough mention. You're very modest in your bio that you submitted to me, but welcome. It's a pleasure. I know you've been involved with Seniors Action Quebec in the past, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. And when Matt's finished, we'll have a question and answer period. As Brendan mentioned, please, as you think of the questions, type it into the chat box so that Katya can ask them of Matt when it's time. And then I'll be coming back and introducing Daphne for the next portion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ruth, for the introduction. And really thank you to Seniors Action Quebec and Ruth and Katya and Brendan. Thank you for the invitation to do this presentation. I'm looking forward to presenting it to you, and we've got some time at the end for some Q&A. So Brendan, I guess if you could lead the way. All right. We'll go to the next slide. As Ruth mentioned, I do have a weekly radio show on CJD. It's been about 6.5 years now. It's every Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's called Life Unrehearsed, and it's dealing with life's challenges. You get thrown curveballs in life, and the show is about how we cope with those curveballs being thrown our way. And whenever I talk about this topic of residences and transitions and aging in place, it's always a hot topic on the show, very engaging. I would also add, I don't know, maybe some people who are attending this webinar might have been at Greg Kelly's. He had a town hall meeting today that I attended. Greg Kelly is an MNA for the Liberal Party of Quebec, and they sorry if we could just mute those ones there. And so Greg, to his credit, in front of about 100 people, had an open forum this morning. It was about 2 hours long, and I would have to say half the time was talked about this exact subject. So it's very timely. And if I could provide a little information and knowledge here, I'm looking forward to it. So Brendan, let's get started. All right, so what I'm going to talk about in today's presentation is aging in place. You know, this isn't all about moving all the time. We do, all of us, I think, want to age in place as long as we possibly can. Then if we need to explore senior living options, what's the difference between public and private? How do we get into a public residence? What's that process through, including evaluations? And I'll explain the different types of public residences. I'll get into waiting times and costs. And then I'll get into some tips for a smooth transition. If ever there was a move made either to a regular retirement home or into long-term care home, I'll be discussing that. And then we'll open it up for some Q&A. Next slide. All right, I think all of us are quite aware of our aging population and demographically. An interesting stat here, the next 20 years, we'll see the fastest growth of our population aged 65 and over. In fact, there will be a 50% increase of those people 65 and over in the next 20 years. It's just, you know, the boomers are aging, and next 20 years is going to see a lot of changing in our population. Next slide. All right. Ideally, I think all of us do want to age in place for as long as we possibly can. And I always like to point out, great, let's try to do that. But what are some of the factors that we need to consider to age in place comfortably and effectively? So I always like to put out there, we want to make sure we're in a safe and a secure environment. Sometimes we do have to make some home modifications, be it if there's a wheelchair, you need to have some ramps. Little things like lighting, for example, is a big thing, particularly if there's a habit of getting up in the middle of the night. So there are many home modifications that can be done so you could successfully age in place. Another important item is the ability to provide proper care. So I'll give you a few examples. If you're alone and maybe you're experiencing some mobility issues and you're in a townhouse or a regular home with multi-floors, that's going to be a challenge. And so mobility is one thing we look at. We also look at cognitive challenges that people face as they age, and particularly if there's dementia, early onset dementia or Alzheimer's kicking in. So you want to be able to make sure you're in that ability to provide proper care. And if you're in a couple, for example, and you're the spouse providing that care, do you have that network, the family that could help out? Perhaps you're getting some CLSC services. And I think we'll be talking a little bit more about this, but we see how our healthcare system, quite frankly, is not getting better. Some will argue that it's broken. So those that are getting CLSC services, wonderful. It's been a challenge to get the actual CLSC services that you need, but start there. And others are topping it off with some private home care as well, so you can age in place longer. I always will talk about, though, caregiver support. There's a lot of caregivers out there. 1 in 4 in Canada, believe it or not, are caregivers, and they're taking the load on their shoulders. You know, they're trying their best to caregive for a loved one, but meanwhile, they may be the ones that might be getting sick. So we always want to make sure you have a good support network. And if all those are in place, great. Try to age in place for as long as we possibly can. Next slide. Now, if you do need to make a move, sometimes people move from homes into a condo or just a regular apartment. That's okay, but most people, as care needs increase, start to look for the appropriate senior living options. What senior living communities are out there? In Quebec, it's categorized basically into 2. There's RPAs, that stands for Résidence Privée pour Aînés. That's more like what you and I would know as a retirement home. And RPAs are categorized into independent living, where you live your very independent life with a kitchen, washer, dryer, but you have access to certain amenities like dining rooms, pharmacy, or dépanneur, and there's activities going on. So that's called independent living RPAs. The next level up would be assisted living, where you're getting some assistance with care, medication management, housekeeping, maybe even assistance with dressing, bathing, toileting. That's considered assisted living. And then there are those that will have memory care, those that specialize with staff that understands dementia and dementia diseases like Alzheimer's and Lewy body and so on. Now, in RPA, there are only private options available. There's no such thing as public RPAs, okay? So I just want to clarify that, because the next stage, if we can go to the next slide, would be nursing homes, or what we know here as Quebec, CHSLD in Quebec, Centre d'hébergement de soins de longue durée, or sometimes you might hear of RI. RI is a ressource intermédiaire. Both are considered long-term care. It usually means there's more than 3 hours of daily care required. Now we're talking perhaps severe mobility issues or cognitive issues. There might be toileting issues like incontinence, certainly assistance with dressing and undressing and bathing. And in long-term care in Quebec, we have private or public options available to you. Next slide. Now, how do we get into a public residence? Well, in Quebec, there's only one way to get into a public residence, and that's through our local CLSC. So they're throughout the province of Quebec, and I'll explain the process, what we need to do. If we can go to the next slide. So you do need to reach out to your local CLSC if we're talking about wanting to get you or a loved one into a public residence, and you need to request an evaluation for placement into long-term care. And so that's a bit of a process just to get an evaluation. It usually helps if you already have a CLSC open file where you could approach your caseworker or social worker and you could put in that request. If you don't, it's a bit of a struggle, but you really do have to advocate. It could take 2 to 3 months to get an evaluation, but don't give up and really persevere to try to get that evaluation done. Next. I always like to stress the importance of communicating your situation. As Canadians, we're nice people, but sometimes it's our job to properly communicate how challenging it is at home, especially if you're the caregiver. So don't hold back. Communicate some of the challenges you might be facing, whether it's mobility issues, can't get dressed, undressed, can't toilet properly, cognitive issues. There may be even, the role of a caregiver, unfortunately, and there's millions of them across Canada, no one really was formally trained. No one took caregiving 101. That's very rare. You're thrown into the role of caregiver and you're doing the best you can. But sometimes you need to step back and truly look at the situation because many caregivers are struggling. And you need to express not just the needs of your loved one, but your needs as well. Okay, next. Now, regarding the evaluation process, if you're lucky enough to get an evaluation, they'll do something what's called in most situations, and I'll get you to, Brendan, to the next slide. It's called an ISO-SMAF, and I'm generalizing here. This is for most CLSCs, not necessarily all of them, but just to give you an idea what's involved in an evaluation. SMAF, by the way, is Système de mesure de l'autonomie fonctionnelle, essentially grading. It's a score from 1 to 14, and it's going to grade how independent or how dependent you are, your autonomy. So we'll go to the next slide. I've got some more details. This next slide is a lot of information. I don't want to confuse you, but just to give you an idea, there's basically 4 categories in an ISO-SMAF, and there are subcategories. It's a score from 1 to 14. Okay, and example, category 1, where you get a score of 1, 2, and 3, you're losing some instrumental activities of daily life. For example, you can't do your groceries anymore. Might be a little bit more difficult to talk on the phone or do some cooking. These are called instrumental activities of daily life. Can't pay your bills as well. The next category, in category 2, we're talking predominantly mobility issues. Okay, and then the next category 3, we get more cognitive issues that we're dealing with, and this is a very extensive report, sometimes 30, 40 pages long. And then category 4, which is a combination of cognitive and physical. And after they do that evaluation, you get a score, and then you get you're categorized in 1 to 14. So we'll go to the next slide. What happens with this score? So the results of the score of this evaluation, and I'm saying ISO-SMAF, some use other evaluations, but the bottom line is there an evaluation needs to be done by the CLSC to determine if you qualify for long-term care public residence. And from there, they're going to prioritize. So next slide. In general, again, if an ISO-SMAF score comes into that range of 10 to 14, that's quite high. The highest level of care in Quebec is CHSLD, Centre d'Hébergement de Soins de Longue Durée. The next level down is a score of around 8 to 9, which is just a little less than CHSLD. So for example, some RIs still long-term care, but they may not have lifts, or if it's a 2-person transfer, or if there's heavy incontinence. These are truly CHSLD levels. RI is just a little bit less care involved. And then next slide. From there, if you do qualify, the social worker will say, okay, they'll give you a list of residences in the public system for a permanent bed. It will usually try to be in your territory that you live in. And then you select one. Usually you select one. There are other CLSCs that will allow you to select a second category, or like a second choice and a third choice, but usually it's the top one that we want to try, or they're going to try to get you into. And that's called for a permanent bed. The challenge with our good old healthcare system is that the waiting lists are quite long, and it's not getting any better. It's, in fact, I would say pandemic, March 2020 to be exact, there were about 3,000 people waiting to get into a public residence. The stats showed as of last month, that number bumped up to 4,500, 4,500, almost a 50% increase in those 3 years. So there are long waiting lists to go into a permanent bed. So what happens in the meantime, you may have the ability to go into a transition bed. Unfortunately, none of us have a say as to where that transition bed is. You could advocate to try to keep it in your geographic region, but there are transition beds. There's a whole triage system, first come, first serve, and it will be the public healthcare authority saying, this is where your mom, dad, wife, husband, loved one will go to. Next slide. So repeating just what I've just mentioned, it's always based on a priority level. It's not necessarily first come, first serve. You know, I've had situations where, you know, it's been an 80-year-old gentleman with early onset Alzheimer's. It's just become too much at home, clearly needs a CHSLD, but that person will be compared to a 97-year-old woman, wheelchair bound, full-blown Alzheimer's. Obviously, that person is going to have a higher priority level. And the priority levels will vary by region. And like I say, it can go from anywhere from 6 months to 3 years waiting for a permanent bed. Next slide. What does it cost? I get this question all the time. So these are the 2023 rates for a public residence anywhere in the province of Quebec. Individual rooms, just over $2,079. 2 beds to a room, $1,700 and change, and 3 beds to a room, which are less and less, by the way, since COVID, but it's around $1,300. It was about a 4% increase from last year. People, I get asked very often, you know, I can't even afford $2,000. Well, we're in Quebec. They will always make sure that you will never pay more than what you're bringing in. But they're going to go through all your assets, all your finances first. And if you truly can't afford to pay these rates, then you have the right to apply for a subsidy, and they will at least leave a couple $100 on a monthly basis, disposable income over and above. Okay, so not to worry in Quebec, even if you can't afford these rates, you have the right to apply for a subsidy. Next slide. Okay, some people get discouraged with the public system and they want to pursue private. You could even pursue private while waiting during that 1, 2, 3 year period while you're on the waiting list. So just to give you an idea of what's available out there in private. Next slide. So to repeat, there's 2 categories of senior living options: RPAs with those 3 categories, independent, assisted, and memory care. There are even some retirement homes that have all 3 of those categories in the same residence under the same roof, just in different sections. And there are others getting very popular, are these smaller home type residences that can provide good levels of care, usually less expensive than the bigger retirement homes, but you do have full options in RPAs. In long-term care, we're getting less and less options in private, but there are still a few out there. And like I mentioned, those smaller ones are picking up the slack a little bit for some of the long-term care as well. And just to repeat, we're looking at more than 3 hours of daily care. That's how it's categorized in long-term care. Next slide. All right. I talk about the search. Sometimes it could take a lot of time. It's overwhelming. It's usually the first time experience in Montreal, Greater Montreal. You're looking at over 400 private options. So there's a lot of questions and information. So you could do the research on your own, online, visit places. But to let you know, there's agencies like Lianas and others like Lianas where they'll help you guide through that whole process. It's free of charge. In fact, there are several companies like Lianas. I'm actually on the executive board of the ACHQ, Association des Conseillers d'Hébergement du Québec. There are others like us, and it's all in the spirit, same concept, free of charge, trying to guide families through this search. So know that there are some resources out there to help you explore in the private sector. Again, if you want to explore public, you need to go through the CLSC. Next slide. If you do, now, private, I always get asked costs for private. Very, very challenging to give an exact cost. Every residence will do their own evaluation to determine room size, apartment size, the list of services that you need, from basic things like housekeeping all the way to care services. Do you need meals? Do you need 1, 2, 3 meals a day? Do you need medication management? Do you need assistance with dressing or undressing? Or I don't need any of that. Maybe I need indoor parking only if you have a car. So in general, a 1-bedroom to 2-bedroom in independent living with minimal services could anywhere range from $1,100 to $3,500 per month. Assisted living somewhere in the range of $3,000 to $6,000 per month, and long-term care, this is more than 3 hours of care. You're at the low end of 4, it can get up to 9, even $10,000 a month at some of these high-end private residences. So that will give you a range at least, but please understand every residence will do their own evaluation, which is what we want, by the way. They're going to establish a customized care plan. Next. Good to know that if you are over 70 years old in Quebec, you could potentially qualify for a tax. This is a provincial government tax credit for home support services for seniors revenue in Quebec. If your annual income is less than $60,000 a year and you're over 70 and you're a Quebec resident, you will automatically qualify for a tax credit. It's somewhere in the range of 10 to 15% of your monthly rent. And even if your income is more than $60,000, there's a scale, so there will be some money there for you. I think the amount these days is close to $180,000 to $190,000. If you're making more than that, the government's saying you're good, you're not getting that tax credit. But there is some money out there from the provincial government. Essentially, what the government is saying, there's no more rooms in the hospitals, there's no more rooms in the public residences. At least let's subsidize the private sector for a bit. Next slide. I'll be wrapping this up soon, Ruth. I know I'm on the clock. Tips for a smooth transition into a residence. We always like to suggest to personalize the room, particularly if someone's moving with cognitive issues. Bring those pictures. You don't have to bring the big furniture, but bring the memories, the pictures, paintings. Those are always good to try to personalize the room. The duvet, the pillow, the comforter, something that will make the family member comfortable. Meet with the staff, get that customized care plan done. Make sure they understand the likes and dislikes, the history of the person moving, the culture. Do your best so that on day one, they know about your loved one moving in. Also, very important, try to communicate with your loved one. Try not to hide this. So that's a surprise. This is where we usually run into trouble. I recognize these are easier. It's easier said than done. These are difficult conversations, but try your best to communicate with your loved one. Try to keep them involved from the very beginning as to what's going on, because one day there will be a transition. I do recognize, particularly with cognitive issues and dementia, it's not an easy, but whatever you can do to communicate as opposed to hide. And if you can, transitions regardless, long-term, wherever, it's going to be difficult, little ups and downs at the beginning. So try to be present. However, don't be over-present. Let the staff, whether it's public or private, let the staff do their jobs. Let them get to know your loved one. So it's always good to be there, certainly at the beginning in the transitions. The higher level of cognitive care, you've got even some head nurses that will say it might be good for the first 48 to 72 hours not even to show up. It's a judgment call, but be present, but not overly present. And last one here, I think, as mentioned, and I will always stress this, take care of yourself throughout this whole process. And don't be surprised. I know Daphne is going to be talking a lot about long-term care. We have a long road to go regarding long-term care, but there is progress being made. Don't be surprised after that 1 month, 4 to 6 week transition period that all of a sudden you realize that, you know what, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. I'm getting a little bit more sleep. They're in good hands. So that's all part of the taking care of yourself. And it's a good old oxygen mask analogy like you hear on the airplanes. It's the same thing for caregivers. And I think that's it. I guess we'll throw it open.
Well, Matt, thank you. Thank you. This was marvelous. And what a wealth of information you've provided us with. And I know that everybody who's attending this afternoon can relate to either some of their members of their organizations, their family members, or even them themselves. So Katia, do we have questions that we can ask Matt?
Yep, we sure do. Matt, hi again. I just wanted to ask you if you could just go through, just maybe explain a bit more the priority level to get a room or a bed in a CHSLD. Can you give any other examples of what would be deemed more priority than normal priority, I guess?
Yeah, so as you saw, the higher score on an ISO-SMAF, which is 11 to 14, this is usually a case where there's severe mobility issues or a combination of severe cognitive and mobility. Okay, so it's a double-edged sword. I've had some families saying, geez, I wish they scored terribly on my ISO-SMAF so they'll get a higher priority, you know. But where we tend to see, and again, I'm not in the public system, I'm basing this on clients and talking to the public CLSC social workers all the time. But if you start exceeding well more than 3 hours of care, you're a 1 or a 2 person transfer, you can't go to the toilet on your own, severe dementia, communication, aphasia, now that score is creeping up to the 12s and 13s and 14s, you will be a higher priority.
Okay, perfect. And I just wanted to remind people, just because someone unmuted themselves and raised their hand, the questions go in the chat box, please. It's just so we keep the recording nice and smooth and clean. Okay, so the next question was, Matt, can you just sorry, words right now. Can you just explain a bit more the tax credit and who qualifies for a tax credit and kind of what the numbers are?
Yeah. So the 3 criteria, now again, this is a provincial tax credit, okay? And 3 criteria: resident of Quebec, over 70 years old, and income. If your income, and you could have a fancy house and it could be worth a lot, that's not income. It's your annual T4s, okay? If it's less than $60,000, 70 years old, Quebec residents, you will qualify for 100% of that tax credit that is out there. And there's a sliding scale after $60,000, okay? It's usually filled out by the residents on the family's behalf, and it's retro to day 1 of move-in. Okay, so I'm just really bringing it to your attention because this is found money for families, 10 to 15%. I'll just use a number. If you're paying $3,000, there might be $300 to $400 every month deposited into your bank account from the province of Quebec. So there's a formula that usually the residents will fill out on your behalf, and it will ask you what types of services you're getting. Are you getting meals? Are you getting housekeeping? Are you getting care services? How much is your rent? That all gets compiled into that formula, and it spits out what your monthly tax credit will be.
So here's another question for you. So I'm going back to your analogy of the oxygen mask. So for people to kind of do this as smooth as possible, whether it's for their grandparents or parents or aunts and uncles, what have you, when do you start that conversation? Do you start that conversation with someone when they retire, when they're in their 50s? What do you like? Yeah. Talk to me about that.
Good question. I actually tackled this topic a couple times on my radio show because it's a very hot topic, because it's not easy. You don't want to necessarily bring it up because you know what the answer is going to be. Don't move me. I'm staying where I am, you know. And however, you do want to start the communication as early as possible. Just get the ball rolling, have these discussions. And what I always recommend is look for trigger events. I call them trigger events. Trigger events I'll throw a couple of examples of trigger events. A hospitalization, a slip and a fall, the oven that was left on, food that should be refrigerated that was found in the cupboard, a neighbor that made a successful transition to a retirement home or a long-term care. These are all trigger events. There's a good time to bring up a conversation lightly, diplomatically, and oh, geez, what would happen in a situation like this? You're not ready, we know that, but let's say 2 years, 3 years down the road, have those conversations if you can as early as possible. Look for trigger events. And the only other recommendation that I would have right now is look to your medical professionals as well. Sometimes you're the bad guy, whether it's an adult child or a spouse, and you're having these difficult conversations with a loved one that wants nothing to do with this conversation. Lean on your medical professionals, the social worker, the doctor, who could, you know, they're neutral. They're in the best interest of the individual. Sometimes it's the doctor that will say, you know what? It's not safe at home anymore. You need to consider alternative living communities. So try to lean on the medical professionals as well.
Okay, so a whole bunch of questions came in about the tax credit after you kind of started with the general. So I'm going to hit you with a few questions. You ready?
All right.
Alrighty. So can you qualify for a tax credit if you don't have a lease?
Yes. If you are living at home and you're getting snow removal, you're getting a house cleaner, you're getting whatever services at home that are related to care, those are all eligible for tax credits as well.
Perfect. So same question, but for if you live in a condo and you're a senior, do you qualify?
Absolutely. If you're getting, even if you're hiring a private home care company, you could claim these expenses. If you're in a condo, in a regular apartment, you don't have to be in a residence.
Okay, I think you just answered the third question, because the third question was, is the tax credit only applicable to when you move into a residence, or does it apply to living at home too? So I think you answered that.
Yeah. It's actually
Perfect.
called a home tax credit. The reason why residence is popular, and they wonder if it that's your home, that's your address. So if you're in residence, it also is good. And if you're at home, it will obviously qualify as well.
Okay. Okay, here's a tricky question. So if there's long waiting lists for public long-term care living, and your only option is either home care or putting someone in a private residence, do you have any tips for how to deal with that?
Right. So if you clearly see that mom, husband, wife, in a year or 2 or 3 years from now, it's inevitable that long-term care will be required, I always try to get on the waiting list. Okay, if you can. While waiting, you have the right to, first step is usually CLSC help at home. Usually you never get the number of hours that you want, but that's usually first step. Then you usually top it off with some private home care to get more help at home. Then it eventually reaches to a point where private home care becomes too expensive and it makes more sense financially and from a caregiver perspective to make that move and transition into a retirement home. Okay, so age in place for as long as we can, take care of yourself. But if you're getting burnt out or the care needs of the person you're taking care of, then it's the time to start searching for some retirement communities, senior living communities. Tap into resources like us that can bring you around, ask those questions, and you don't have to make a decision. But at least, knowledge is power a lot of the times. It's good to get out just to see, because there's this fear that these residences are all terrible and, oh my God, it's the last thing I would want. And doing a couple tours, you might realize, you know what, there's a lot of people like my husband or my mom or dad that were there. Mom will go by and say, only old people live there. That's very common. And then, mom's 89 years old doing the tour saying only old people live there when the average is actually 84 or 85. That's okay. But just to have the experience, to be able to go through, to match the culture. We always say, have a complimentary lunch. They'll give you a complimentary lunch, not just to test the food, but to see everyone around and to see if that's a matching of your culture. Even language, English, French, religion, all comes into play. So we always encourage to do some visits, because you'll get back and usually feel a little bit more relieved, not completely relieved, but you'll feel better about, okay, it's not so bad.
Perfect. Okay. 2 more questions came in about the tax credit. Actually, this is a good question. For the tax credit, is the eligible amount the same, or is it different for a couple?
It increases with a couple.
Perfect.
So there's a little higher threshold on income because there could be 2 incomes coming into government pensions coming in. So it increases by a little bit.
Okay. And then is the tax credit the same as, say, a shelter allowance?
No. This is really, it's a home tax credit. Okay, so you could reach out to your CLSC, your accountant, if you've got an accountant, your financial planner. It's called the provincial home tax credit.
Okay. Okay, there's a question that came in about I guess, procedures to get into a public residence or CHSLD, does your GP need to fill out a form that has to be given to the CLSC in order to apply?
Not necessarily. It's not a bad idea, because the social worker, if you're calling and the social worker has, dozens of calls to return, but all of a sudden it's backed up by a GP saying clearly this individual requires help, it will help. Okay, but it's not obligatory. The social worker or the person still has to get evaluated from someone from the CLSC, but a doctor's letter actually will help.
Okay. And do you have any tips, say, for seniors who just need to do the research for themselves on how to find a long-term care or residence for themselves?
Yeah, it's well, certainly if they're comfortable online, there's lots of information from the government sites, provincial government. You could just type in public long-term care homes in English, and there's lots out there to understand. Private homes, you could also do some Google searches. If you are looking private, I say, why not take advantage of resources that are out there free of charge, that have all the information. They know your area, so tap into that free resource, I would suggest.
Okay, I think we're good for the questions.
Well, thank you, Katia. Thank you, Matt, for answering all those questions. And you can see there's a lot of different options and services that are available. It's to find what is needed and what's the best route and how to do the research and gather up the information. I cannot thank you sufficiently. It's been great. I really appreciate you giving us your time.
I had a question that was not answered. I had a question in the chat.
You put your question in the chat box, dear?
Yes, I put it in there.
Okay, close your mic and Katia will read it.
It was the question regarding food and healthcare expenses, Katia.
Oh, did I miss it? Brendan, do you have it in front of you? Because I'm scrolling to find it. So
It says the cost you posted, they include food and healthcare expenses.
So Matt, the question, the different quotes of prices you gave us, does that include medication and food?
Right, so I'll distinguish the pricing that I gave for the public residences. If we're talking public, $2,079 a month, that's all in, all your care, all your food, housekeeping, laundry, that's all in. In the private sector, you saw that there's big distinctions, and that's where you'd have to determine, because some people don't require food. Some people do require food. So I can't give you exact pricing on that in the private sector. It will be done after that evaluation. But if you're referring to the public, it's all in.
Great. So we'll continue. Thank you, Matt. I know you have to dash off to another engagement that you have. I encourage you all to listen to Matt on Sunday afternoons, Life Unrehearsed. And what time is it, Matt? 2 to 4?
From 4 to 5 on Sundays on CJD.
4 to 5.
Yeah.
Okay. And everybody knows CJD, so I'm sure you'll have no difficulty finding him. Check out his articles in the Suburban. And I really appreciate you doing this. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
So without further ado, I'm going to turn over and we go to the next portion of today's session. And another longtime friend and community activist and a caring individual. And this lady puts us all to shame, I'm sure. Dr. Daphne Nahmiash, who is currently the president of Dignité, an organization that helps people with handicap and disabilities. And a little bit, because I could go on and have about 3 pages of introduction for Daphne, but I had to pick and choose. I'm sorry, Daphne. Daphne was a member of the National Seniors Council from 2007 until April 30th of 2011. She is a member and the former chair of the McGill Center for Studies in Aging, the Education Committee. She was the chairperson of the NDG Community Committee on Elder Abuse that she founded in 1989. And I'm going to give away a secret. She was the president for over 20 some years. She was an adjunct professor at gerontology and social studies at the Université Laval with a PhD in social work. She is retired several years ago from her position as Director of Professional Services of the CLSC NDG and as Commissioner of Complaints and Quality of Services at the Centre de Santé et des Services Sociaux Cavendish in Montreal. But it didn't end there. That would never be the case with Daphne. Daphne has been working in the field of seniors' health and social services for the past 50 years. She's been the recipient of many awards, and rightly so. And she's just a plain, caring individual who wants to bring about change that's going to improve the quality of life of seniors. She is an expert in elder abuse. But today, Daphne is going to speak to us about long-term care facilities. We all know what went on during COVID, and we all know we don't have sufficient beds. And without further ado, Daphne, thank you for doing this, and I can't wait to hear what you're going to tell us.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all of you for coming and for staying this long. I think a lot of you have been here since this morning. Some of you will have heard me talking about ageism, which is another of the big things that I'm talking about, and has a lot to do with also how every country, and including Canada, including Quebec, treat older people. So we're going to look a little bit about this. Matt was excellent in terms of his information, but he did present a bit of a rosy picture, because I don't think that caregivers have such an easy time, nor residents or seniors, in terms of finding the right place for their loved ones at the right time, because of a number of factors. So I'm going to talk a little bit of some of these things. Unfortunately, I only have 20 minutes, so it will be all very brief. And I have made a few slides just to kind of keep me focused and online. So yes, I am the president of Handicap Life Dignity. This is an organization which is bilingual, by the way, but the organization mainly in the past years in the past 30 years, actually, this is a picture that I put in of my team, or some of my team, and it's at the 30th anniversary of Handicap Life Dignity. We were in one of the CHSLDs at the time. We celebrated our birthday within the CHSLDs. We're going to talk today about the issues in long-term care, problems before and during the pandemic, and possible solutions. Next, please. So my presentation will look at the long-term care system before the pandemic very briefly. What did the pandemic reveal regarding the long-term care system of housing? What changes are there in the long-term care system since the pandemic by the ministry, if there are any? Are there changes, and are these changes what we want as a society? What is missing in the new long-term care policy? And what would residents and caregivers like? In fact, has anybody asked them? How can we get what they want to make a better care system for seniors and vulnerable adults in the future? Followed by a couple of questions. So I'll try to go very fast, and I hope I won't be too fast for you. Next, please. So how is the long-term care housing system before the pandemic? I have been working in the province, by the way, for since 1967. So basically, when I look at what we have, it hasn't changed greatly in the last years. The first things are the RIs, which he did talk about, the resource intermédiaire. These are alternative resources for people with special needs very often. Then the family care homes, which we used to call them in the old days, but now they're called RTFs, which are Ressources de Type Familial. The private residences for seniors, Matt talked a lot about, so I'm not going to go into any details about each of these categories. The rehab hospitals and the respite beds, but those are transition usually, and the CHSLDs, public, private, and private. Okay, so I don't have time to go into details about them, but if you actually look on the internet, for those of you who are good at this, you can find a lot of information, as Matt said, about the type, what they are, what your senior or loved one might fit into, etc., or what you might want to look at before in planning your long-term care, actually. We specialize in my organization in also trying to tell people what their rights are and trying to help them advocate for those rights. This is our main business in handicap life dignity. Next, please. I just want to re-echo also what Matt said in terms of in 2060, we will double the population in terms of the number of seniors, and seniors will be 25% of the population, which is a huge amount of people. Also, I want to mention the fact of the Alzheimer's disease, because we know that over 80% of the people in CHSLDs, long-term care residences, and even in housing, but particularly in long-term care residences, over 80% are have neurocognitive diseases and Alzheimer's disease, etc. We also know that this is going to increase. The number of people in 2030, that's not long now. We are already in 23, so this 6-7 years, the number of people suffering from Alzheimer's disease is going to double. So bear this in mind as I'm going through the presentation. I'm just going to go through a little bit about what were the problems in the long-term care homes before the pandemic. So HVD, I'm going to call it my organization now, identified many problems in CHSLDs and the other housing types also. In 2018, in a conference which included residents committees, non-professionals and professionals throughout Quebec. We did a very large conference. And we wanted to ask people, were there problems in long-term care homes and in long-term care in general, and what were they? And what do they think could be the solutions to those problems? So we did a series of workshops, which are actually on our website for those of you who are interested. In March 2019, we completed a report because Marguerite Blais, who was the Minister of Seniors at the time, originally I'd asked her to be the animator of our workshop. And as you all know, she became the Minister of Seniors, so she wasn't able to do it basically when we did finish publish our results, etc., and when we did the conference. So basically, we completed a report for the ministry of the identified problems and recommendations. It took us a long time, actually. It took us quite a while to get it together and to be good enough to present to the Minister of Seniors and her cabinet. So this is available for anybody who's interested in actually reading it. But what's important is that way back in 2019, we had already documented what all the problems were in the long-term care system, etc. These problems were similar to those identified in the COVID pandemic, and the recommendations made to improve the quality of care and services of those in long-term care homes and residences had not been implemented at all, even though we had at least 3 meetings with the ministry and the cabinet at the time. So they knew way before the pandemic what the problems were and didn't really resolve them. So that's why there was big problems at the time of the pandemic. Next, please. Next slide. Yes. So what were the questions that rose from the pandemic? I'm just going to summarize them. That the CHSLDs were too big and difficult to manage in a pandemic. Now, they're still very big and difficult to manage from the point of view that I just did a little survey in one of the CUSs. For those of you who don't know, the CUSs are the health and social service centers in each of our regions who are in charge of health and social services and the organization of, etc. So in one particular one that I looked at, this is an urban one, there were 17 long-term care homes, just to give you an idea. So if you're visiting there's a big range of them. And the smallest was 83. The largest was 276 beds we're talking about. So 276 in this one, in one institution as an example. And the average number, when I looked at all of them, was 160 beds. So this is one of the problems of giving good services, is that they're very large. Now, as I said, they go down to about 83, the smallest. So basically, some of them are a little bit smaller and more manageable. They also, at the time, did not have a coordinator in place within the CHSLD, which is one of the big problems. So the communication between the people and the caregivers and the person in charge of the CHSLD was not in place. That was one of the good things, though, that the ministry did. They now have made sure that in each CHSLD, especially the big ones, that there is somebody actually who is in place and to improve the communication. The next things are that our healthcare and housing system was unprepared. We all know that, for the pandemic. They didn't expect it. They didn't have time to prepare it. So we can't entirely put the blame. Residents were on lockdown for at least 4 to 5 months, suffering from extreme isolation. This was the worst thing that happened to the residents, because if you remember, all the caregivers who were doing a huge amount of work in these homes were taken out from one day to the next. And some of them were feeding on a daily basis their loved ones, etc. So this was a big problem at the time, and could be again if there was another pandemic, unfortunately. They were not allowed to even go out of their room into the hallway for over 100 days in most of the places. And we know that over 5,000 residents died. Most of the people who died were actually living in those long-term care homes in the first wave. Some of abuse and neglect, and not even COVID. There was a huge lack of staff, which was one of the main problems. Nurses and PABs, those are the personal support workers, and who had also difficult work conditions, low salaries, lack of training, etc., to be able to deal with the people in there. I'm very much summarizing because we don't have time to go into all of these individually. Staff were working on several floors because of the lack of staff, and were therefore passing the virus continually to the residents. And the last one, families and caregivers were not allowed visits for several months, and often didn't even see their loved ones before they died of COVID. I have several friends who basically lost their parents and could not even say goodbye, which was also a big problem and a big mistake, I think. Next, please. HVD actually did a large petition, and in the space of 1 to 2 weeks, we got 700 signatures on our petition that the caregivers had to be able to go into that. But it took several weeks before the government listened and actually let the caregivers go back in there. Some of the residents also found it terrible that people were so dressed up in masks and gowns. I think that's very hard always for them, because it takes away the humanity from the people. So the pandemic unpreparedness led to a few things. First of all, human rights of residents and caregivers were basically taken away. So they could not disobey or do what they would normally do. Neither the caregivers nor the residents had any real human rights that were being observed. And that's a very serious thing, actually, that I'm concerned about if it ever happened again. Loss of personal belongings. They were being moved out of their rooms, and in the meantime, losing some of their personal belongings constantly. There were lack of PABs and no or little communication with caregivers for months sometimes. Many were sick with the virus. The same situation was also in senior private residences and other long-term care resources. So I'm not going to go into what the problems in the residences were, but there were big difference between if you were 69 or 70. If you were 69, you could leave the residence, you could do pretty much what you wanted. And if you were 70, you had to stay indoors, etc., and obey all the rules. So there was a lot of inequality between residences. And the last one was that private long-term care homes were in a similar situation. So it's not always rosy in the private long-term care homes either. The worst situation that we had in the whole of Quebec was actually the Heron residence, which was a private home. So I don't want you to think that always, if you pay $3,000, it's a Garden of Eden. And in some cases worse, as I mentioned. So next, please. Now I've depressed you all a little bit, but we all know all this stuff because it was in the newspapers on a daily basis. Long-term care system housing, what have we learned? So let's say what were the good things. We've learned more about how to manage a pandemic. That's one good thing. I think we'll do better if it ever happens again. The government trained additional PABs, personal support workers. They trained 10,000 in a very short space of time because of the desperation of the situation. And we had 10,000 people missing in the low income here, in the CHSLDs, and increased salaries. And we even paid for the formation. So we did a few good things, but there was a bit of inequality between those who were there before and the new ones, etc. So it still didn't solve all of the problems, but it was better. We're still missing, I think now we're missing about 3,000 in the result, just to let you know. We produced more PABs, but there are still not enough for the future, as many quit after their contract finished. So they were hired, they were trained, they were paid to be trained. They had to do at least a year. And then at the end of their contract, they realized that they hated the work or they couldn't do it and they quit. So we're still missing a lot of people. We've learned about the usefulness of caregivers. I think that was one of the good things, because I don't think anybody realized how much work the family caregivers are actually doing for the loved ones in these homes. And I think one of the things that we do a lot also in our organization is we defend the rights of caregivers and try to guide them in the right directions and hopefully solve their problems. And hopefully we won't make the same mistakes again, in general in the future. So that could be a good thing. We have a new long-term care policy in place. Actually, our organization was very lucky. We were, I think, the only organization that actually got a seat at the table because of our complaints and our the work that we had done. They actually not hired, but because they were all volunteers, but they actually brought in one of our consultant to be part of this long-term care policy in place. And actually, I have to tell you all, this is a good thing that happened. The long-term policy that we have now is very good, and it has a lot of good things in it. It has a set of values and principles, etc., as to how long-term care or people in long-term care who have those needs should be treated. And a new model of housing came out of it, the Maison des Aînés, that's the house of seniors. These are small houses which are implementing, they cost a lot of money. I think they cost like about $800,000 per bed, I saw written somewhere, which is a lot of money because we need many, many of them. We would like to see a lot of home care resources and people able to age in place, because it's not as rosy as it was being put forward quite this morning, because it's very hard to get the resources that you actually need to age in place, and caregivers become very exhausted, etc. But we also need these small maisons des aînés, which are the smaller version of the CHSLDs, and give better care, much better care, because they're dealing with maybe 32 beds rather than 276, for example. So these are the things that I need to tell you. So pay attention. And I think that big is not always beautiful. I think small is often much more beautiful. And we need to have a much better range of options. Okay, next, please. One of the other things is that people don't have a choice, really. Most of the people who go to a long-term care residence, it's not the choice of the senior themselves. Like, I'm 82. If I ever, hasbi khalila, I hope I never have to go to a long-term care home. But if I do, I hope that I'll have choices, and I will certainly know more about them, that I could plan a little bit in advance. So all my caregivers will be able to, since they're always listening to what I have to say. What we have not done. So I wanted to mention a few things that we've not done. We barely changed the structures of the long-term care system in the last 50 years, I think. We still mainly have large long-term care homes, as I mentioned before. Instead of alternative housing in the community, I'd like to see more innovative, small alternative housing, whether it be co-op housing or interesting models of housing based on, say, Scandinavian countries who have great community housing ideas. I did see for Alzheimer's, there's only one, I think, in Canada, maybe more, but I only know of one that's in British Columbia, a dementia village, which is really a well-designed idea for people with Alzheimer's, which basically doesn't look like an institution. And we only have, as I said, as of now, it's going to take several years to really set up all of these small maisons des aînés. We haven't changed also from the present medical model. One of the biggest problems in long-term care homes is the medical model, and it's not a social and rehab care, at least not the CHSLDs. We need to have more socially based services, which includes good communication between caregivers, others, etc., good rehabilitation. People very often, in 3 months after being in these places, they deteriorate a lot. And they don't all need to, if there's more rehab within the institutions, etc. We need good independent evaluations, satisfaction surveys, and better governing, etc. We haven't made it possible for most seniors or other vulnerable adults to stay in their homes with adequate resources, nor enable couples to stay together. This is a big thing. Sometimes couples would like to stay together. I've lived with my husband for 58 years, for an example, and I can't imagine us being separated, one in a home, one not in a home. We would like to stay together. There aren't many possibilities for that. It's very difficult. It is possible in a residence before you go into the long-term care hospital, for example. We also need to reduce our wait times and evaluations for services. Matt talked about this. Right now, it's anything from up to at least 600 days, which is crazy. I mean, really, can you imagine somebody who is taking care 24 hours a day of somebody with Alzheimer's disease, which is very severe, or other mental health illnesses, or just intense physical illnesses too, and they have to wait so long even to be seen, to do an evaluation. This is a very big problem. So basically, these augment the depression and the burden on family caregivers. We do know that most people actually who commit abuse and neglect of older adults basically are caregivers because they have depression and other types of illnesses. We have not created new alternative financially feasible living arrangements. Basically, we haven't made it, if people need a lot of resources and they would have to pay for them in order to be aging in place, it costs, we're not giving them the same opportunities in terms of funding other than the tax credit that he's talking about, which is not enough. As in, say, if you're in a residence where even the residences get to supplement their services with other funding from the government. So these kinds of things, we need to be more neutral so that it's equal across the board in long-term care residences or residences even in all of the long-term care options. There isn't equality. This I find sad and a problem. Next, please. Next. Thank you. So do we have better or worse housing system now? It looks now similar to what it was before, except we're more ready for a pandemic and we have a vaccine available. That's one of the excellent things that we do have. We have a set of values and principles, as I said, from the government stating how care should be given, which we never had before. These are only appropriate, however, if they're enforced and implemented, which may be difficult under the present structures. The Maison des Aînés, I mentioned some only 32 beds, give us a little hope as they're smaller and are more home-like. As community advocacy organizations, which some of you are in, or in a situation to fight for better services, or even some of you may be just in many of these different senior organizations, we need to fight together for better long-term care for seniors. Otherwise, it will not happen. Since you've heard that we're going to be a quarter of the population, we have a good chance of voting people in now. We have power, or we will have in 2060. We should use that to make sure that we get better treatment and better organized services for long-term people who need. These people are the most vulnerable people, basically, who exist. The people who are have severe disabilities, etc., whether they be physical or whether they be mental. And this, we need as a society to be able to fight to get them good services at the end of their lives. This thing is also important, that caregivers and vulnerable seniors and other vulnerable adults need more choices. It sounds like when you go through all the housing and when you read it in the book that we have a huge amount of choices. In reality, it doesn't look like that because of waiting lists, because of the priorities lists, because of all kinds of other issues. It's not as good as it could be, that we have a lot of choices. However, I do think what Matt said is true, is that we should be planning it and we should be going to visit them, etc., and not assuming that they're all bad either. Some of them are giving excellent care, some of them are giving not so excellent and have a lot of abuse and neglect. So basically, we have to be careful and get a good feeling about the place before we choose it. I don't know about putting your name down in advance, because I don't know that that would make any difference to how we end up, but it's certainly worth visiting in advance. Seniors will soon represent, as I mentioned, 25% of the population, which gives us the power to effect change. I can't say it enough. Next, please. I think I have one more. How can we prepare ourselves individually? First of all, we should be keeping ourselves in as good shape as possible, physically, mentally, and financially, from being a baby boomer onwards, so all our lives as much as possible, because we have a much better chance of not ending up in a bad situation in the end if we do look after ourselves. And informing ourselves about what the available resources. I loved what Matt said, because at least he gave a lot of information. by coming up with our own community ideas for innovative long-term care housing. Small communities could get some ideas too, and also read about what's going on in Scandinavia and what types of housing, or even in England. None of my seniors, actually, none of my family members, because I come from the UK, actually ended up in long-term care homes. So I was quite delighted by that they stayed home until they were 96, etc. So that's what we could all be doing if we could keep in good shape, and also make sure that we can plan for good resources with it to keep us at home and not put too much burden on our caregivers. This means advocating for what we want, not just accepting what the government offers. Because just because government decides what they want to do, we don't necessarily have to accept it. We have to. This is what we are doing now in our organization more than ever. We are pledging to do advocacy for better long-term care for adults who are severely disabled, etc., as well as for seniors. We're also, the final thing is voting to get the government to give adequate budgets for end-of-life care, because obviously it costs a huge amount of money, and yet we give much less percentage actually of our budget than in Scandinavia or in other countries. So we could actually vote to try to increase these budgets too. And home care resources, because home care resources have never been adequate. I was a home care coordinator for many years also. And we were at the time when I first started able to give everybody pretty much the services that they required. Now we can't do it anymore. Or if we need to have to move and to go into different types of residences because of our lack of family members who could help us, or lack of neighbors or whatever, small alternative housing with care solutions. So that's what I have to say. And I wish you all well. And I'm sure you have a few questions.
Daphne, thank you. Thank you. Lots to think about, lots to plan ahead for. And as you say, get involved, get informed, and be prepared to speak up and say what we require. Katya, do we have questions?
You see, we have a lot.
Not surprised. I'm turning it right over to you, Katya. I don't see. Oh, there she is.
Hey, Ruth. Okay, Daphne. So one of the first questions that came in was, oh, sorry, I lost it. Give me a second. Has the staff ratio to clients improved, especially during nights in
No,
long-term care situations?
no, not as far as I know. We should be having a ratio of 1 to 4, and we don't have it by any means. So basically, this is another thing that I didn't even write down on my list. I could add a lot more on my list. Basically, I just didn't have time in the 20 minutes, but we should be fighting for better ratios, and because that's part of the way we lose a lot of our staff, because they're not going to work if they can get say 4-to-1 ratio in Ontario or in the US. They're going to move and not stay where we are necessarily in Quebec with our poor ratios of more like 3, much larger than that. And the salaries also have not been upgraded to a good, respectable salary for somebody who does really work, which is extremely difficult. That's what we have to remember, how difficult this work is. I don't think people know. People in general don't want to come into even organizations to work about long-term care. People don't want to kind of, it's a little bit ageist, but people want to kind of avoid it as much as possible, this type of work. And they prefer to work with children or other areas. And I've been a gerontologist, as you heard, for many, many, many years, and it's a big issue still.
Okay, so I'm just gonna try and expand on what you said in your presentation, because the point of these webinars is that they're for seniors, but they're also for caregivers and organizations and staff who work with seniors or people who work with seniors. So
Yes, absolutely.
you referred into your presentation a couple of times on the maison des aînés. Sorry?
Yes.
Yeah, les maisons des aînés. So
Yes.
I was wondering if you could just explain kind of what that is and sort of what the model is.
It's like a nursing home, I would say, what we used to call a bit nursing homes at the beginning. It's for the same criteria of people, but in a small scale. So we're talking, as I said, about 32 beds versus a large institution. And it's supposed to take into account the cultural needs and the languages and all of the ethnic issues that we have to deal with in Montreal and Quebec, so that these would be small places where you could actually have staff who speak your language if possible. The food would be also suitable, much better than it is now. Let's put it that way, because it isn't that great. So in some places it's good. If you're paying $3,000, maybe it would be better than if you're paying $1,000. But it's not that great always, the food, and people get tired, and also people prefer their own food. So also they would have an adequate amount of nurses. They would have access, I assume, to a doctor, because one of the problems in the pandemic was that the people didn't necessarily even have access within the whole CHSLD to a doctor. And if they got COVID and they didn't get moved quickly enough or evaluated quickly enough to get the treatment, etc. So, but these, I mean, if you read it it does describe it. If you look on the internet, the Maison des Aînés, and it looks like the kind of place you would really want to be in if you had to be in a long-term care home and leave your own home, but or one that you'd like your loved one to be in. And then so that's what I'm assuming that it is, with better principles, better values, and also adequate staff, of course. So you have somebody in charge, so that you don't have to go running around to find people in charge, etc. That's the way. I haven't visited personally one of the super new ones. I don't know if Matt did, but that's how it's supposed to be.
Okay, and so within
the
that,
ones in the English community that I saw in one of the territories that I looked at, they mentioned Grace Dot, which was going to be made into a series of 4 or 5 of these Maison des Aînés. But that's like one little drop in the bucket in terms of the English community at this point.
Okay, but you are also talking about alternative feasible living arrangements, so that people could stay home longer and not go into long-term cares. So could you just give very quickly, because it's 2:50, but an example of what you meant by that? So are you talking about intergenerational living? What exactly do you mean?
Well, some of them could be intergenerational living, because I think that that would, I think we don't need to be put in a block only with people our age and our illnesses, etc. We could be living in the community and have resources come from outside into our homes. This is what I think is the most feasible. And even when I first started the CLSC home care program, we were doing a lot of that. We actually organized neighbors to even go in to help people in their homes as much as possible. And we organized all kinds of things. Things are possible when they're done on a small basis and on a local basis. Whereas what we've gone to in the last 10 years or 15 years is more a centralized version. I really believed in the CLSCs and the types of work that they were doing. And I felt that I seemed to have enough resources for everybody. I didn't say no to people, whatever they asked me for. I managed to be able to give them all. I had 60 staff members, and it was enough for our community. But now the number of seniors has grown exponentially. That's the other issue. So, but it was never planned into expanding the resources to the same extent. So that's one example. But I think in Denmark, they built housing for years, basically, which was community housing. And people weren't getting a huge building or a huge house. They were getting smaller places with people going into them and bringing the services. So that to me is the big. We had actually a project like this in Montreal for a long time. I don't know if any of you remember it, where they actually tried it out, and it was successful as far as I could see, but it was never implemented. And I have seen co-ops in different parts of Quebec when I've traveled around a lot, you know, with the work that I do. And I've seen some good examples of where in other parts of Quebec, not so much in Montreal. There is a downtown in Montreal, the Milton Park project, if everybody knew about that. That was one of the first projects in Montreal. It's a huge project of housing, etc., where people live together, and we plugged all kinds of resources into that housing model. Both resources that were public, but also neighbors and volunteers. I had 250 volunteers, I remember, in the CLSC that went into people's homes. So it's possible to do, but only on a local basis. You know, now we're kind of this is what bothers me about the government, is that it's a centralized model. That's what they want, because it for them, that's accountability, or a lack of accountability. But basically, I think the centralization has done a lot of harm, because we have many layers of management too. So that, for example, in the CHSLDs, there wasn't one coordinator even that you could actually talk to that was in the building, which doesn't make sense if you've got 276 or whatever people living there.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we'll end it there, because actually it's kind of a good bookend what you just finished with what we were talking about this morning, because we were talking a lot about, you know, social housing and projects like that. So I think there's 6 minutes left, so I think I'll stop the questions there, and I'll pass it over to Ruth. And yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katia, and thank you, Daphne. And for the people that are listening to Daphne, I think you can grasp the wealth of information and experience that she has. And I did admit mentioning your ageism programs and webinars that you do. And Daphne, I can't thank you enough, because I know you're busy and I know everybody wants a piece of you. And, you know, you're being the president of a big organization like you have, and a very important one. I know this is cut into your time. So I really appreciate you preparing all your slides and the time that you've been here with us. It's been great. I can see that there's still a lot of work to do. Ever since the pandemic, but even before that, I can see that there's major work and advocacy that's required on many aspects to housing and to seniors' life and quality of life in general. So the work is just beginning, I think. We're just coming out of 3 years of being shut in. And I think we have to pick up the pieces and start moving forward again. And I appreciate all the time that you've given us, and it's been excellent. So thank you very, very much. For those who are on the line, you will be getting a copy of Daphne's presentation and the recording. That'll go out in about a week's time. It'll be uploaded on our social media platforms, our website, our YouTube channel. For those who were unable to be here with us, they can still look at it and have meetings together and discuss and be informed. And like Daphne says, get yourself, do your research now. Don't wait till you're in a crisis situation. There also will be a survey that will be sent to you, and we would ask that you complete that so we know we're in the right direction, and that our funders can have numbers and some feedback on how these were received. And for those of you who are still interested, and there's still several webinars on housing. We will be doing one on housing options. That will be coming up in November the 24th. Safety and accreditation standards that afternoon. We will be also down the road talking about the impact of poor housing on our health. Low-cost housing, social housing, not in my backyard. So that you can sway the concept of communities who are looking at social housing negatively, a success story, what are the gaps, and moving forward. So we've got a whole series lined up for you with excellent presenters. So we're not just finishing today. So hope it's wet your whistle, and we'll give you information that will perhaps get you wanting to become involved with organizations in your region, Seniors Action Quebec, Daphne's organization. So without further ado, I want to thank everybody for taking their time and coming and listening and participating.